What really happened to British redcoats, and why did the most iconic military uniform in history vanish from battlefields? You've seen them gleaming outside Buckingham Palace, those magnificent scarlet tunics representing centuries of British military tradition and imperial might. Most people think they disappeared because of better camouflage or modern warfare. However, the shocking truth is far darker. The real story involves catastrophic military failures where British soldiers became walking targets, massacred in colonial wars while generals refused to change. What you're about to discover involves cover-ups, institutional stubbornness, and thousands of unnecessary deaths. On any ceremonial occasion, there they are, resplendent in their scarlet tunics, bearskin hats towering above the crowds. The household division still wears the red coat for state occasions, trooping the colour and standing guard outside royal palaces. It's a sight that makes tourists gasp and cameras click furiously. But here's what most people don't realise. These aren't the original red coats at all. The modern ceremonial tunic is a carefully reconstructed costume piece, brought back in the late 19th century specifically for pageantry after being abandoned for actual military use decades earlier. The Guards regiments, the Life Guards, the Blues and Royals, the Grenadier Guards, they're all wearing what amounts to historical fancy dress when they parade in red. But it's expensive fancy dress. Each tunic costs around 1,500 quid to produce, made from superfine wool that's dyed using modern synthetic reds that would have been unimaginable to an 18th century soldier. The brass buttons alone, 80 odd of them depending on the regiment, cost more than a decent meal out. They're individually cast and hand-polished, and each regiment has its own unique button spacing pattern, a detail so arcane that most British people have no idea it exists. What's truly remarkable is how the tradition has been maintained through an unbroken chain of regimental pride, even though the practical red coat was ditched well over a century ago. The Coldstream Guards trace their lineage to 1650, making them one of the oldest regiments in continuous service. These regiments have been wearing red in one form or another for nearly 4 centuries. But the version you see today, that's a carefully curated heritage performance, not a continuation of active service uniform. The last time British soldiers wore red coats in actual combat was during the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, and even then commanders were already questioning whether it was madness to dress soldiers like mobile targets. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these types of videos. Why not share with a friend? Okay, back to it. Here's where things get properly interesting, and where most history books give you a sanitized version that's only half true. Everyone assumes the British chose red for their coats because it was bold, intimidating, or because it represented the blood of England's enemies. Absolute nonsense. The real reason is far more mundane and, frankly, more revealing about how military decisions actually get made. A red dye was cheap. That's it. That's the shocking truth. In the 17th century, when the British Army was being formalised, red dye was one of the most economical options available for dyeing large quantities of wool. It came primarily from madder root, a plant that grew abundantly in Europe, and cochineal, made from crushed beetles imported from the Americas. Both produced various shades of red, and both were significantly cheaper than blues requiring expensive indigo, or purples needing rare mollusks. But here's the bit that doesn't get talked about enough. Red was also practical for a rather grim reason. Blood doesn't show as obviously on red fabric. When you're in the midst of an 18th century battlefield with soldiers standing in rigid lines getting shot at by muskets and cannon, you don't want your troops seeing their mates covered in blood. It's bad for morale. A red coat might be soaked in blood, but from 20 feet away, in the smoke and chaos of battle, it just looks like a red coat. Dark blue or white would show every wound, every splash of gore. The practicality went further. British soldiers were often fighting in European winters. Red wool, particularly the thick stuff used for military uniforms, was excellent at retaining heat. The dye process actually made the wool slightly more weather-resistant. When your army is marching through a German winter or camping in the Low Countries during the rainy season, having a coat that keeps you warm and relatively dry is worth its weight in gold. Let's talk about what it was actually like to fight in these iconic uniforms, because the romantic image of disciplined redcoats advancing in perfect lines bears only passing resemblance to the sweaty, bloody, terrifying reality. A British soldier's red coat in the 18th century was part of a complete uniform that included white breeches, black gaiters that went up to the knee, a white waistcoat, a black leather stock around the neck that forced you to hold your head up, and a black cocked hat, or later, a shako. In summer, you'd be roasting. In winter, the coat was never quite warm enough once you factored in standing guard duty in the rain. The coat had tails, which soldiers would button back when they needed to move quickly or sit down. When you add in the musket, which weighed about 10 pounds, and the full pack for a march, which could weigh 40 pounds or more, you're looking at a soldier carrying around 60 to 70 pounds of kit in a thick wool coat that doesn't breathe. Hygiene was a nightmare. These coats couldn't be washed properly. You'd brush them down, try to get mud off, but actually washing a wool coat would shrink it and ruin the dye. So soldiers wore the same coat for months, sometimes years, and it absorbed sweat, blood, gunpowder residue, and everything else. The smell of a regiment on the march must have been absolutely spectacular, and not in a good way. Lice were a constant problem. Every soldier had them. In wet weather, the coat became a miserable burden. Wool absorbs water, and a fully soaked red coat could weigh twice what it did dry. Soldiers would be marching in coats that weighed 25 to 30 pounds, with water running down inside their collars, their white breeches turning brown with mud, their feet blistered in poorly fitting shoes. And then they'd have to fight. The discipline required to stand in line, soaking wet, being shot at, and maintain formation was extraordinary. The British Army started to realise they had a serious problem with redcoats during the colonial wars of the mid-19th century. In India during the 1857 rebellion, British soldiers in their scarlet tunics found themselves facing Indian sepoys and irregulars who had learned to fight from cover, using tactics that made every bright uniform a liability. The old European rules of warfare, where armies lined up and blasted away at each other, didn't apply in guerrilla conflicts. The Crimean War in 1854–56 was a wake-up call, though not immediately. British soldiers still wore their red coats at Balaclava, at Inkerman, in the trenches around Sevastopol. They died in enormous numbers, though more from disease and poor logistics than from enemy fire. But astute observers noticed that the French, in their darker blue coats, and the Russians in grey-green, blended better with the landscape and seemed harder for sharpshooters to target effectively. It took decades for this lesson to fully sink in, partly because of institutional conservatism and the expense of re-equipping an entire army, but mainly because of sheer bloody-minded British stubbornness. The attitude was, we've conquered half the world in red coats. Why should we change now? But the wars in Afghanistan, particularly the brutal conflicts of 1839–42 and 1878–80, demonstrated the problem clearly. Afghan tribesmen were excellent marksmen with jezails, long-barreled muskets, and they fought from elevated positions where British scarlet provided excellent aiming points. The Second Anglo-Afghan War saw British soldiers starting to improvise. They dye their white helmets with tea or coffee to make them less visible. Some units started wearing darker-coloured frocks over their red coats. It was a piecemeal, unofficial recognition that the redcoats' days were numbered. But the final nail in the coffin came from Africa, where the tactical vulnerabilities of bright red uniforms would become undeniably catastrophically clear. Enjoying our deep dive into the redcoats so far? Make sure to click like and try out YouTube's hype feature. It's pretty cool. Changing an entire army's uniform is phenomenally expensive, and this is a factor that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about why the redcoat lasted as long as it did. The British Army in the late 19th century had tens of thousands of soldiers, and each one needed a uniform. The infrastructure for producing red coats, the dye works, the woolen mills, the tailors, all of this represented an enormous investment that couldn't simply be abandoned overnight. Changing to khaki meant building new supply chains and training new suppliers from scratch. There was also the matter of regimental identity. British regiments were intensely proud of their traditions, and the red coat was central to that identity. Proposing to dress soldiers in drab khaki was seen by many as an attack on centuries of honour and distinction. Regiments fought to keep their distinctive facings and details, which is why different coloured collar patches and insignia still appear on modern British Army uniforms today. The transition period saw soldiers wearing red for home duties and khaki for overseas service, creating a patchwork of uniforms that lasted for years. It wasn't until World War I that the redcoat vanished completely from active military use. The Western Front, with its machine guns and artillery, made concealment a matter of life and death. Despite being militarily obsolete for well over a century, the redcoat remains one of the most recognisable aspects of British military history. Part of this is clever tourism marketing. The British establishment recognised that visitors loved the ceremonial guards, and maintaining that tradition became economically valuable. The changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace draws millions of visitors annually who spend money in hotels, restaurants and shops across London. The redcoat also represents a particular era when Britain was a global superpower, when the Empire covered a quarter of the globe. For some, this evokes pride in British military achievement. For others, it's a reminder that this dominance came at enormous human cost to colonised peoples. The uniform itself is politically neutral, but what it represents certainly isn't. Films and television have kept the redcoat in popular imagination. Every period drama set in the Georgian or Victorian era features redcoats as visual shorthand for British military presence. The problem is that these depictions often show pristine, bright uniforms rather than the filthy, faded, patched reality of campaign service. There's also genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship involved. A ceremonial redcoat with its perfect tailoring and brass buttons is genuinely beautiful. Modern military uniforms are functional, but rarely aesthetically striking. The redcoat represents an era when even utilitarian clothing was expected to have visual appeal. Though whether that's something to be nostalgic about when soldiers had to fight in it is another matter entirely. Let's address something that makes people uncomfortable. The redcoat is inextricably linked to British Imperial expansion. Those soldiers didn't just fight conventional European wars, they were the enforcers of empire, present at actions from Ireland to India to Africa, some glorious, many brutal, all complex. The Amritsar massacre in 1919, where British troops opened fire on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. Those soldiers wore khaki, but they were the direct successors of the redcoats, serving the same imperial system. The brutal suppression of the 1857 rebellion, the Opium Wars forcing China to accept British drug trafficking, these conflicts define part of the redcoats' legacy as much as Waterloo or the Peninsular War do. This isn't to say individual soldiers were villains. Most were working-class men who joined for steady pay and 3 meals a day. They followed orders and endured terrible conditions. But the institution they served used them to enforce imperial control, and we can acknowledge both the soldiers' personal circumstances and the system they were part of without contradiction. Modern Britain is still working through its relationship with empire, and the redcoat sits right in the middle of that conversation. It's simultaneously heritage and a reminder of oppression, military excellence, and colonial violence. Different communities see it very differently, and both perspectives are rooted in real historical experience. Today's ceremonial redcoats serve a function that has nothing to do with military effectiveness and everything to do with tradition and national identity. The soldiers who wear them are real serving soldiers, highly trained professionals who also perform ceremonial duties. They're performing a role utterly different from their predecessors who marched into battle wearing the same colour uniform. There's something slightly absurd about it, if you think about it properly. We've taken a uniform designed for 18th century warfare that proved disastrously unsuitable for modern combat and preserved it as national costume. It works because humans respond to ritual even when we know it's been carefully curated rather than organically preserved. The cost of maintaining these ceremonial traditions is substantial. Each regiment maintains its ceremonial uniforms and trains soldiers in drill. In an era of tight budgets, some question whether this is the best use of resources, though supporters argue these traditions have value as part of Britain's global image. What's interesting is how Britain's commitment to maintaining the redcoat tradition is actually quite unusual compared to other nations. most countries have relatively minimal historical military dress on public display, but Britain has made it central to its national pageantry. This reflects particular attitudes about history, monarchy and identity that are distinctly British. On any ceremonial occasion, there they are, resplendent in their scarlet tunics, bearskin hats towering above the crowds.